On the morning of Friday the 2nd of October 1874, after a peaceful night's journey along Regents Canal, the crews were only minutes away from dawn. For the men who worked London's waterways, it was one of the quietest moments of the day. The canal was calm, while beyond its banks the smoke, noise and relentless bustle of Victorian London still slept. In just a few moments they expected the rising sun to awaken the capital. Instead, an explosion did. A blast so devastating that it blew out windows up to 3 miles away, sent terrified animals into panic at the nearby London Zoo, and obliterated an entire bridge. This is the story of the Regents Canal explosion. 3 hours earlier, Regents Canal was one of the few places in London that was still awake. City Road Basin was already busy. Cargo had been loaded, ropes secured, and one by one the boats began their slow journey out into the darkness. Steam tug Ready eased away from her berth shortly after 2 o'clock, the engine settling into its familiar chug, 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 as 5 flyboats followed behind. The Jane, the Dee, the Tilbury, the Limehouse, and the Hawkesbury, all lashed together for the journey to the Midlands. Together they crept through the sleeping capital at little more than walking pace. Beneath one bridge and towards the next, the heavy barges moved almost imperceptibly through the dark waters of Regent's Canal. The only sound was a gentle ripple of water, and the occasional muted creak of timber rubbing against timber. By sunrise, the crews expected to be leaving London behind. Overnight journeys like this were a familiar part of life on Britain's canals. One tug could haul several loaded flyboats far more efficiently than each barge making the journey alone. This convoy, however, was carrying something far more dangerous than an ordinary night's freight. The Jane carried a small quantity of gunpowder, but it was the Tilbury that carried the greatest danger. Her cargo consisted chiefly of sugar, coffee, nuts and straw boards, together with 2 or 3 barrels of petroleum and around 5 tons of gunpowder from Waltham Abbey, all bound for the Midlands. The men aboard knew one another well. They worked together, ate together, and trusted one another. Most had made the journey many times before. Among them was Charles Baxton, the steerer of the Tilbury. At 35 years of age, he had spent much of his working life on the waterways. Working alongside him were 25-year-old William Taylor and 19-year-old Jonathan Holloway, who had left his family in Oldbury the previous year to make his living on the canals. Also aboard was a young boy learning the trade, whose name has not survived in the historical record. Like thousands of canal men before them, they accepted the risks of the job and never imagined that this routine journey would become their last. Every week, Britain's canals carried the cargoes that kept an industrial nation moving. Coal for homes and factories, timber for builders, bricks for expanding towns, food for growing cities. Day and night, an endless procession of flyboats travelled quietly through the country's waterways. This convoy was no different, at least not to those who watched it pass. Beneath the covers of 4 of its 5 flyboats lay thousands of pounds of gunpowder. Several also carried petroleum. Both were essential commodities in a nation transforming at remarkable speed. Gunpowder blasted tunnels for new railways, shattered rock in quarries, and helped drive Britain's expanding industries. Dangerous though it was, transporting it by canal had become an accepted part of everyday life. After nearly 3 hours on the water, dawn was fast approaching. For the men aboard the convoy, this was simply another shift. Working Britain's canals was demanding, often meaning 14 or more hours on duty, with only short periods of broken sleep snatched whenever the journey allowed. Steering heavily laden flyboats required constant concentration and physical strength, while schedules frequently meant travelling through the night to ensure valuable cargo reached its destination on time. It was hard, exhausting work, but for generations of canal men, it was simply a way of life. As the eastern sky slowly began to brighten, there was every reason to believe the journey would continue as it always had. Before long, London would awaken, the convoy would leave the capital behind, and another overnight run would be almost over. Ahead stood Northgate Bridge, an elegant cast-iron crossing carrying traffic into Regent's Park. The convoy had passed beneath it many times before. Just before 5 a.m, the barges reached the bridge and were passing directly beneath its brick arch when something caught the attention of the crew. A faint blue flame had appeared aboard the boat. At first there was confusion. One voice called for the tug to stop. Another shouted to keep going. Faced with an emergency few had ever encountered, nobody knew which decision offered the best chance of saving the convoy. They would never find out. The Tilbury exploded. In an instant, thousands of pounds of gunpowder detonated beneath the bridge, killing the crew where they stood. The Tilbury had simply ceased to exist. The force of the explosion had torn the narrowboat apart, scattering timber, iron and cargo across the canal and surrounding streets. Behind the Tilbury, the Limehouse was sunk, while the Dee was badly damaged but remained afloat. The steam tug Ready was battered by the blast. It was fortunate that the gunpowder aboard the Jane did not ignite. A towering column of thick smoke rose above Regent's Canal, followed by a great blaze of fire. The deep cutting of the canal channeled the force of the explosion east and west through London, hurling shattered masonry, twisted iron and burning wreckage across the surrounding area. For those living nearby, the day began in terror. Many believed an earthquake had struck. One witness described feeling a sudden shock and lift, and then a perpendicular fall, followed moments later by a single deafening report. Families were thrown from their beds as their houses violently shook. Roof tiles crashed into the streets, and chimneys crumbled like chalk. Women and children fled into the streets, some still in their nightclothes, others wrapped hastily in blankets, convinced their homes were collapsing around them. The destruction spread for miles. Windows were shattered as far as 3 miles from the canal, while the sound and shock of the explosion were reported across London. At the nearby London Zoo, the explosion sent frightened animals into panic. Elephants trumpeted, birds burst from damaged aviaries, and resident keepers rushed into the darkness, calling out to the terrified creatures before fear spread through the rest of the collection. By extraordinary chance, the loss of life was far lower than it might have been. A watchman who had spent the night on Northgate Bridge had stepped away only moments before the explosion. Nearby, 75-year-old gatekeeper Mr. Edwards and his family narrowly escaped when their lodge was almost completely destroyed. One son leapt from an upstairs window to save himself, while another awoke to find an entire wall of his bedroom had vanished. Northgate Bridge had fared little better. The brick arch had been demolished, sections of masonry thrown into the canal, and the iron pillars twisted and scarred by the force of the explosion. A crossing used every day by countless Londoners had vanished in an instant. Rescuers and curious onlookers quickly converged on the scene, but there was little they could do for the men aboard the Tilbury. Charles Baxton, William Taylor, Jonathan Holloway, and the young boy learning his trade had all been killed instantly. Their bodies would be recovered from the wreckage over the hours that followed, bringing a tragic end to what had begun as an ordinary night's work. As news of the disaster spread across London, one question overshadowed every other. What had caused such a devastating explosion? At first, nobody could say for certain. The destruction was so complete that many of the answers had vanished with the Tilbury itself. Witnesses spoke of seeing a faint blue flame shortly before the explosion, but how it had started remained a mystery. The inquest examined several possible causes. One suggestion was that lightning had somehow ignited the cargo, but there was little evidence to support the theory. Investigators eventually reached a different conclusion. The Tilbury was carrying both gunpowder and petroleum. They believed that flammable petroleum vapours had escaped from the cargo hold through a small opening into the boat's cabin, where a lantern was almost certainly burning. At that early hour, the crew needed light to carry out their work. It was not considered careless. It was simply part of life aboard a Victorian canal boat. A naked flame, petroleum vapour, thousands of pounds of gunpowder. Investigators believed that was all it took. Newspapers questioned how such dangerous cargoes could be carried through the heart of a city where thousands of people lived and worked. One publication described the convoy as little more than a moving torpedo, warning that it was only by remarkable good fortune that the loss of life had not been far greater. The disaster exposed shortcomings in the way explosives were transported. Regulations already existed, but they were inconsistent, poorly communicated, and not always enforced. Risks that had long been accepted as part of everyday commerce could no longer be ignored. Just a year later, Parliament passed the Explosives Act of 1875. It introduced far stricter controls over the manufacture, storage and transport of explosive materials, reshaping the way dangerous cargoes were handled across Britain. Although the bridge was destroyed, it was not lost forever. It was rebuilt using many of its original cast iron columns, some of which still stand today. But the crossing became known as Macclesfield Bridge, named in honour of Lord Macclesfield, who, as chairman of the Regents Canal Company, had helped steer the ambitious canal project through a financial crisis decades before. Without his intervention, the canal itself might never have been completed. And yet for most Londoners, the bridge is remembered by a very different name: Blow-Up Bridge. The disaster is still remembered today. A small blue plaque fixed to Macclesfield Bridge marks the events of the 2nd of October 1874, reminding those who pass that one of London's most violent peacetime explosions took place here. The bridge itself is also part of that memorial. When it was rebuilt in 1876, many of the original cast iron columns were reused. If you look closely, you can still see the deep grooves worn into the iron by decades of tow ropes before the age of steam. More than 150 years later, the scars of Victorian canal traffic remain visible to everyone who crosses the bridge. The sun rose over Regents Canal that morning, just as it had the day before, and just as it has every day since. But for the men aboard the Tilbury, that sunrise never came. The loss of life aboard the Tilbury was tragic, but it got me thinking. With railways eventually taking over from canals, how much dangerous freight is transported through our modern cities on a daily basis without our knowledge? Do you think that ignorance is bliss? Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.